and you're watching NDTV 24/7.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Rebooting India. I'm Shweta Rajpal Kohli. Inflation continues to be a big worry for the people as well as policymakers. It has now hit a 7-month high in September, mainly driven by high food prices and also now increasing the odds for yet another interest rate hike by the central bank at the end of this month. So let's first take a look at what those inflation numbers are and what's driving up the inflation index. Inflation has clearly touched a 7-month high. It has risen to 6.46% in the month of September, which is much higher than what most analysts had predicted. They were hoping that inflation would be around 6% in September. Food prices have seen a jump of 18% in September, and what's driving it mainly? Onion, vegetables and diesel that continue to drive up inflation. But the big question is, will we see another rate hike coming to cool down those rising prices when the RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan reviews the policy later this month? Let's also try and bring you what's really driving up inflation and how much have onion, vegetables and diesel really contributed overall. So onion prices have risen 323% in September compared with the same period last year. Vegetables up 89%, diesel up 20%. And taking a look at the trend, that is also very important to see the month-on-month trend in inflation from the beginning of this fiscal and how inflation has been consistently rising from April. 4.77% is what it was in April and has now touched 6.46%. Food inflation particularly has seen a huge spurt from April onwards, where it was just at about 6% levels in April, now jumping to 18%, well over 18% clearly. Food inflation continuing to be a big cause of worry, driving up that overall inflation number. In fact, to discuss what this really means for you, we've got with us Meera Sanyal, Royal Bank of Scotland Country Executive and Chairperson, and DK Joshi, Chief Economist of Crisil, both joining us from Mumbai. But we will be going to our guests in just a moment. First, let's take a look at how people are really feeling the pinch of rising inflation.
So onion prices still skyrocketing even here in Rajasthan. Do remember, it's a state that goes into elections in a month and a half for now. And will onions be an issue? We're going to ask a few people here. भैया एक चीज बताइए, why are prices not coming down? कम क्यों नहीं हो रहा है onion का rate?
कम जहाँ ये या तो प्याज दबा रखा है, अंदर दबा रखा है प्याज, तो प्याज की तो बहुत है लेकिन खेती तो बहुत हुई है लेकिन दबा रखा है प्याज, इसीलिए आ ही नहीं रहा है। वहाँ का एक तो बारिश हो रही है, जहाँ से आ रहा है नासिक से, तो बारिश हो रही है वहाँ पे, इसीलिए प्याज आ नहीं रहा है।
तो जब आप मंडी में जाते हो तो क्या होता है? What do they tell you? They say कि प्याज है, बट आप कहते हो कि इतना महंगा है, आप खरीदने जाते हो तो वहाँ पे ट्रेडर क्या बोलता है आपको?
वहाँ पे ये बोलता है कि वहाँ से आ ही नहीं रहा है और आधा प्याज तो खराब निकल जाता है, बिल्कुल सड़ा हुआ प्याज निकल जाता है, तो उनका भी कोई कसूर नहीं है। तो हम भी तो वहाँ के 60 रुपये वहाँ बोलते हैं, 55 बोलते हैं, तो 60 यहाँ बिकता है, 60 70 कोई बेच रहा है, कोई क्या भाव बेच रहा है।
So demand and supply. So it's all about demand and supply, as he's saying. पर आपको लगता है onions मुद्दा बनेगा इलेक्शन में?
जी दीदी, अभी तो ये मुद्दा पहले भी था और अभी बनेगा ये, क्योंकि अभी कम नहीं हो रहा है। अगर ये थोड़ा और कम हो जाएगा तो फिर ध्यान नहीं होगा इतना, लेकिन अभी तो थोड़ा बहुत ये मुद्दा प्याज का रहेगा ही, महंगाई के हिसाब से। तो
और जो सब्जियों के दाम है, प्याज के दाम है, उससे क्या तकलीफ?
अरे प्याज ही खाने को नहीं मिल रहा है। अब हम गरीब आदमी कमाते तो है नहीं, अब प्याज कैसे खा सकते हैं कि प्याज? जब हमारे को दाल आटा ही नहीं मिलता है, रोटी बड़ी मुश्किल हो रही है हमारे लिए, तो बहुत परेशानी हो रही है। हम बुढ़े आदमियों को तो बहुत हालत खराब है।
So there you have it, the average person, the average middle class, lower middle class person, for them every 5 rupees, every 10 rupees is an issue, especially for the middle income people. And definitely with elections coming up in Rajasthan, the price rise, inflation and the price of onions is going to be an issue in this election. In Jaipur, Harsha Kumari Singh for NDTV.
There is very little respite from the rising onion prices. The wholesale price index rose to 6.4% in September, which is much above the RBI comfort zone. And yes, the maximum amount of inflation was witnessed in the case of onions. And yet it is a major dampener considering this is the festive season, and of course it is the most widely used vegetable. I have with me here Mrs. Bhatia, who is a housewife, and I'm going to speak to her as to, how onion, of course, ma'am, is probably a vegetable that is used in every household. So, and now with, a further price rise that is expected and has come about, do you think that you've really had to bear the brunt in that sense?
Oh yes. See, the onions are the basic thing in the kitchen, which we require, and we, being Punjabis, we use lot of onions in masala, in salads, and in everything.
So how do you think you will have to reduce your consumption? Do you think it's had an impact, that the rising prices, has it had a direct impact, in the consumption of onions?
Oh yes, I'll have to reduce the consumption somehow or the other. And there we,
for example, do you think that, you'll have to cut it down on your salads, or in what sense? How do you cut down your consumption?
No, see, we make so many vegetables with the onions, where we were using 4 onions in a vegetable, we use 2.
And even in terms of, say, the amount of quantity you used to buy, do you think you've had to reduce the overall quantity when you go shopping for onion?
Oh yes, I was buying 5 kgs of onion earlier. Now sometimes I buy 1 kg only, sometimes 2 kg only. We had to reduce because we can't survive otherwise like this with so much of expense and all.
All right, so the big fallout of rising inflation could possibly be another rate hike that could come in as early as the end of the month. Meera Sanyal, what's your view? Do you see the RBI governor biting the bullet yet again, holding on to his stance and increasing interest rates simply because inflation is refusing to cool off?
Shweta, I think it is certainly likely that we will see an interest rate hike. I would expect about 25 basis points, but I also expect that the governor will allow banks more leeway to borrow, the restrictions on LAF are likely to be lifted. So we've already seen the MSF fall from 10.25 to 9%. And so what I sense the governor will do, given his prioritization of targeting inflation, is to raise the rates but to provide more liquidity to the market.
All right, Mr. Joshi, the sense that one really wants is, and this is a debate that takes place each time we discuss whether high interest rates are able to cool inflation or not. And inflation, as we are seeing, is largely being driven by supply side, by food articles. High interest rates clearly cannot control onion prices.
Well, I agree that if you raise interest rates, you can't bring onion prices down. But I think if you don't raise interest rates, then I think the food inflation or the fuel inflation will very quickly percolate into generalized inflation. So I think that's a costly way of doing it, of preventing high inflation. But I think there's no other way, because the expectations on inflation are quite high, and I think the central bank governor has explicitly stated that he also wants to tame inflationary expectations. So I think from this perspective, I do see him raising interest rates by 25 basis points on October 29, basically to control inflationary expectations.
Right.
The demand is not causing inflation in the sense that that the core inflation, which is the non-food manufacturing, still continues to be low, though it has shown some signs of increasing, because the input costs, because of depreciation of the currency, have risen so much that the industry had to pass on a little bit of those to the end consumer. But I think the core inflation or demand-driven inflation still remains low. So I think in the overall analysis, I think the central bank cannot doesn't have the comfort on the inflation front. So I think they cannot lower the guard at this juncture, and I would see them raising interest rates.
All right, but Mr. Joshi and Mrs. Sanyal, I'd like to now change focus and talk a little about where food prices are headed here on. Remember, we've had a record monsoon, and that's in fact proving to be a silver lining for India at this point. We've seen 6% surplus rains from June to September, and it is the longest monsoon that we've seen in 72 years. The bumper harvests, which are expected in October, is something which is obviously being seen as good news. And we're now talking about higher rural incomes and spending. Rural India overall driving overall growth and and good agricultural output is boosting rural income. Mrs. Sanyal, that brings us to the larger question. Is Bharat going to outshine India? The food inflation that we're seeing and we're worrying so much about, is it actually good news for the farmers? Because are they getting a better price for their produce?
Well, one would certainly hope so, Shweta. I think in a year which has been filled with rather bleak economic news, this is very good news that we've had a good monsoon. And we've always seen in years where there's been a good monsoon, a good bumper crop, well then that lifts the entire economy. So I would certainly hope that some of this will flow through to the rural sector, to our farmers. The problem is, as you have very correctly noted, that there are enormous supply side constraints. We still don't have adequate storage facilities, and I mean, certainly I can share with you my own experience of onion prices. Last Saturday when I went to the market and I was looking for onions, they were selling, they were willing to give onions away for free because a lot of onions had been caught in the rain and were rotting. So what is happening is that there's a demand-supply mismatch. It's not as if there's not enough production, it's simply not reaching the consumer. And what is happening is neither the consumer is benefiting nor is the farmer benefiting. And those are the bottlenecks, those are the structural things that we need to start addressing.
All right, Mr. Joshi, would you also agree with that view that the farmers don't seem to be benefiting? Also, you've particularly written a report earlier on how you believe Bharat is actually going to outshine India, talking about how rural growth is driving overall growth and good monsoon will, after all, boost agricultural growth. Is this rural story the story to watch out for? Because after all, most people expect that agriculture will more than double in its growth rate this year. We're going to see agriculture growing at 5%, and that, in fact, may be the big savior for the Indian economy growth numbers this year.
Well, I think you're right. I think our expectation is that agriculture will grow at 4.5% compared to 1.9 last year, which is more than doubling. But I think one must remember that agriculture is below 14% of GDP, and what's happening in industry and what's happening in services is not good at all. I mean, both these sectors are going to underperform compared to last year. So 86% of the economy, which is industry and services put together, is going to grow at lower rate than last year. We expect industry to grow at 1% and services to grow at 6.5%. Now, how much can agriculture benefit rest of the economy? Had agriculture not grown at 4.5%, the overall growth, which we expect at 4.8%, would have been much lower than that. But I think now coming to the good aspect of that, good agriculture growth is definitely going to help rural consumption, which is quite a sizable part of overall consumption in India. It is already visible in two-wheeler segment, which has a rural focus. I think two-wheeler segment is growing positively. Overall auto sector is in the red zone. Similarly, tractor sales have been good this year. So I think it is spilling over to overall industry, but in a very, very mild manner. So the agriculture doesn't have the muscle to offset the headwinds which industry is facing and which services is facing at this juncture.
Right, so it's an important indicator, but at the same time, we may not see the kind of offsetting that we would like in the overall downturn that we are seeing in the industry and manufacturing. Let me go across to my colleague Hina, who now joins us from the capital, and she's got people with her who have questions for our guests. Hina, what are the questions?
Well, Shweta, I'm here at the Okla vegetable market, the wholesale vegetable market right now. I have with me Mrs. Renu, in fact, who keeps coming here and buying vegetables from here. Ma'am, आप बता रहे थे कि बहुत ज़्यादा महंगा हो गया, लेकिन इस महीने आपको कुछ लगा है कि कुछ प्राइसेस में फर्क पड़ा है?
हाँ, थोड़ा 19-20 का तो फर्क पड़ा है, इससे ज़्यादा नहीं पड़ा है।
हमारे पास कुछ पैनलिस्ट हैं, अभी आप उनसे कुछ सवाल पूछना चाहेंगे कि मतलब इसी बारे में सब्जी के जो दाम है बढ़ते जा रहे हैं?
हाँ जी, मैं यही पूछना चाहूँगी कि इस हिसाब से अब आगे भी ऐसे ही रहेगा मार्केट का रेट्स के कुछ कम होगा?
मंथली बजट की बात करें तो कितना आपको अब जो है प्रॉब्लम हो रही है, कितना डिफरेंस आ गया है?
मतलब कि आधा फर्क पड़ गया है बिल्कुल। पहले हम लेते थे भाई 500-600 के आसपास हमारे को सब्जी हफ्ते की वो हो जाती थी, अब कम से कम वही जो चीज है वो हमें 1000-1100 तक की मिलती है।
Well, Shweta, so this is basically on the ground. This is the question that people want to ask, that when will the prices come down? That is the question that everybody wants to know, looking at what the current scenario is like.
All right, that would be in fact our closing comment from both our guests. Mrs. Sanyal, if you could answer that question, any easy answers out there? When do we see prices cooling off, especially food prices?
देखिए रेणु जी, मुझे लगता है कि जल्द ही दाम कम होने वाले हैं। ये जो इस साल का जो बारिश हुआ है, बहुत अच्छा बारिश हुआ है। नवंबर दिसंबर तक तो सब्जियां की जो दाम है वो घटनी चाहिए। हर साल घटते हैं, इस साल उम्मीद है कि थोड़ा ज़्यादा ही घट जाएंगे क्योंकि बहुत ज़्यादा ही बढ़ गए हैं।
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Joshi, would you agree with that? We will see softening of food prices by November, December.
I think we should see, because if you look at the trend in food inflation, I think there are 4 or 5 shocks happening every year, and I think food inflation does correct, particularly in vegetables and fruits. So I do expect this to come down, but I think more worrying for me is why is the rice inflation still at 18% and why is the wheat inflation still very high, despite the fact that we have so much of food grain stocks. I think so we have to strategically use food grain stocks to bring food grain inflation down. I think that's to do with storage, and not only storage but also effectively releasing the food stocks in the market, so that inflation remains under control.
A very critical point raised there by Mr. Joshi with the bumper crop. Why do we have to see food inflation at the levels that we're seeing? Why aren't policymakers doing something about this? Many thanks, Mr. Joshi and Mrs. Sanyal, for joining us and sharing those thoughts. We slip into a quick break. On the other side, plenty more lined up for you on Rebooting India.